Welcome to this brief presentation on food labels. We're going to discuss the facts of food labels as they are today and look forward to what's going to change in the future. We'll understand the importance of food labels, the components of a food label, and how to use food labels when we're planning meals. Reading a nutrition facts label can be daunting, so we're going to learn to deconstruct the food label and understand what we need to with regard to calories, nutrients, serving size, ingredients list, and the daily value. All of it is governed by the FDA through very strict regulations and requirements. This is set forth via the dietary guidelines, which are adjusted every 5 years to bring us the most valid and reliable research in the field of nutrition. A food label has many components. So if we look at it in color code, if we look at the light blue, serving size is the first thing that we see under the nutrition facts. 1 cup is equivalent to 100 calories. Here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes people think, well, if I eat what's in this box, I'm only eating 100 calories. But you didn't read underneath the serving size of 1 cup says that there are 18 servings per container, which means there are 1,800 calories in the whole box if you ate that. So be aware of your serving size. If you're eating 2 servings or 2 cups, you would double your calories to 200. Same with fat and all the other nutrients as well. If you're only eating half of a serving size, which would be half a cup, then your calories are 50 and your fat is half as well. Pay attention to the calories that you're getting from fat, because fat in total fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, sodium, all of those things can contribute to heart disease and other types of diseases. So we want to pay attention and make sure that we're limiting those in our diet. Make sure that the food doesn't have too much of those in its list of ingredients. And we also note that there are certain things with regard to vitamins and minerals that have to be labeled on food labels. That's a requirement by the FDA. One of the things that's very important to understand is what's highlighted in light green is the percent daily value. And on the right side of the box, you see different percents from 3% at the top down to 8% at the bottom of the list. And if you notice, there are a few of the nutrients that don't have a percent next to them. And the reason is it's not that they're less important. It's just that there's not enough research to determine a daily value. So you want to make sure that you keep your intake low for things such as sugar and trans fat, because those are very, very unhealthy. So when we talk about daily value, it's a recommendation of how much of a certain food we should be eating per day. And the percent of the daily value lets us know what percentage of the total we're eating with this particular food. So for instance, total fat, 2 grams, 3% of our daily value of fat. So that tells us this has low fat, which is good. So when we think about the daily value, realize that it's based on an average diet of 2,000 calories a day. Further down at the bottom of the list here, and you'll see an asterisk, which tells you about the percent of the daily value. And under that, it gives you some examples of fat, total fat. If your diet is 2,000 calories a day, you should consume less than 65 grams. So it gives us some guidelines there as a general rule of thumb. Finally, on the label is the ingredients list. Very important to understand how to read the ingredients. First of all, the fewer the ingredients and the easier they are to read, the less processed and more natural the food is. When we're reading our food labels with regard to ingredients, the number 1 listed ingredient is going to be the highest content of that food. So for instance, if sugar is the first ingredient on the list, that means it has a very high content of sugar. If sugar is the last ingredient on a long list, then it's only a small amount of sugar. So you want to pay attention to that. Let's look at an example of ingredients list from 2 different types of yogurt. So the top one has more ingredients because this one has fruit added to it. And you can see that there's high fructose corn syrup as one of the top ingredients. That's another name for sugar. Beware of hidden sugars. High fructose corn syrup, dextrose, sucrose, those are names, maltodextrin, they're names, all names for sugar. So you want to be careful and make sure that you understand that when you're reading the labels. The label underneath has less ingredients. because there's really nothing added to it. It has the natural ingredients that are in the yogurt, except for a couple of things such as fillers like carrageenan. But with regard to sugar, you see that there's no added sugar to this second ingredient list. If we compare yogurt again, fat versus fat-free, plain versus fruit-flavored, you can see the difference. The one on the left is the fat and fruit-flavored. You can see that's higher calories from fat, higher fat, and higher sugar. Look at the difference in the sugar, 44 grams versus 10 grams. Now, some might say, but wait a minute, the one on the right is plain and has fat-free and has no fruit. Why are there 10 grams of sugar? Any milk product is going to have lactose, which has natural sugars in it. So there are no added sugars. That's the natural sugar. The 44 grams on the left includes the 10 grams of natural sugar plus the added sugar that's added in the form of fruit, also in the form of, whatever they put, high fructose corn syrup and anything else that they add to it. Comparing milk, reduced fat versus fat-free, again, you can see the difference in calories and percentage of fat, but you see that the calcium remains the same. So you need to read labels because sometimes the minerals remain the same, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the fat content and the calorie content is completely different in two very similar products, so you want to be familiar with different types of food labels. When we look at the food labels today, compared to what's coming in the future, the one on the left is today's typical food label. The one on the right is a prototype of what might be in the future. It's a refreshed design. It has updated science to back it, and these changes that you see on the label are going to take place by July of 2018. So there are a couple of very obvious changes that you see to the eye, and that is the calories and the serving size stand out a lot more on the new label. They're a bigger font, a larger font, and also bold, so you really can see them. What we also notice is that the calories from fat are taken out of the new label, and science has shown that it's not as important to state how many calories are coming from fat as it is to list the type of fat that it is and make sure that all of the types of fat are represented in the food label. One of the other things that have changed is the sugars. In the old label, they just gave you the total sugars, 1 gram versus 50 grams, depending, but you don't know where that sugar's coming from. In the new label, they're going to break down the sugar to total sugars and also added sugars. So total sugars include what's occurring naturally and also added sugars that might be in the form of table sugar or high fructose corn syrup or any other type of sugar. The daily value at the bottom is going to be explained a little bit more clearly in the newer label, but it's going to leave out the generalizations of if you're looking for total fat in a 2,000 calorie diet, it should be less than 65 grams. That information is going to be removed. The new label is going to be a little bit more refreshing and easier to read. So one of the other things is that the daily value will change for the new label. Some of the daily value for nutrients is going to be updated based on the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Report. As I said before, every 5 years there are changes based on new scientific research. So there will be changes in the percent of daily values for some nutrients. There will also be a change in the serving sizes. Some of the serving sizes, remember, were based on information we had 20 years ago. The food label has not been changed in 20 years, but over 20 years, Americans' consumption patterns of food have changed. So the new food label will have reference for serving sizes according to the new way of eating. And some people might say, well, that's not really good because if the old version of the food label said a serving size of ice cream is half a cup, and now the new version is saying 2/3 a cup, aren't we just promoting eating more food? And in essence, one could argue that, but the way the government regulations and laws are, the law does not state that you have to um, set your references for serving sizes based on what should be, but rather based on what actually is. So these changes to the food labels will take place, and we should see them somewhere in July of 2018. So, in summary, make it a habit to read food labels. It's so important to know what you're putting into your body. Use your food labels to compare various foods and different brands of food to make sure that you're getting the best quality of nutrients that you can. Because remember, what you put into your body is what you're going to get out of it. Read the ingredient list to make sure that you can understand every ingredient that's in that food. Remember that the least amount of ingredients and the easier it is to read, the least amount of processing has gone into that food and the more natural it is. Use food labels to plan your meals and your calorie intake. For instance, if you know that this food label says you had 400 calories for this meal, well, then you know that maybe for the next meal you may want to have a little bit less if you're on a restricted diet, for example. Or if the food label tells you there was 30% of your daily value of fat in this one meal, well, now maybe for the next meal you want to pick a food that has very, very little fat to compensate for that. Or if the food label says there wasn't enough, you know, fiber, it was only 2 grams of fiber, and we know we need to have at least 25 grams of fiber to have good health for the day, then we know in our next meals to come we got to add more fiber in that meal. So just a few tips to understand how to read food labels. I've also included a link here that will take you to the Food and Drug Administration's site, which will give you more detail on food labels, understanding how to read them, and answers a lot of questions. So I highly recommend you visiting that if you want more information.